So we've defined the detailed metadata that are necessary for interoperability and reusability. And that's mostly covered by the where and when, or the geographic coverage and temporal coverage of the metadata, the detailed description of the data entities that are provided in the data product, namely the 4 files that are in the product folder, and finally, a detailed description of the methods used to generate those files. And that includes the measurement method used to collect the raw data, as well as any methods that we used for processing of those data that's further documented by the pipeline in terms of the code and the source data that are in the pipeline. So these are great for interoperability and reusability, but not necessarily the best for findability. If we want people to be able to find our data, we don't want them to have to dive into all of this detail to figure out what the data are about. We need to summarize what these data are about somehow. So we're going to talk now about the elements of metadata that help us summarize a given data product. If we go back to the Easy EML editor, and we can look at the elements of what EDI requires in terms of EML elements in terms of summarizing the data product. And that's going to include 3 things here: the title, which we have in our outline, but we haven't actually defined the title for our data product yet. Then an abstract. And the title and abstract are fairly abstract things. You just have this text box to fill in for whatever you want your title to be. And similarly, for the abstract, you just have another text box. They don't really give you a lot of guidance on what belongs in an abstract. Generally, though, the title is going to have something about what, when, and where were measured, and maybe a little bit about how, especially if it's a novel method. But the abstract should really contain a little bit of everything: who, what, when, where, why, and how. If you've got a good abstract, you should cover all of those elements in a general sense of what your data product covers. And finally, the last summarization is the keywords here. And keywords are really important for search algorithms. And you really want to keep the keywords down to a limited number of terms that you really think define what your data product is all about. You don't need 10 different keywords here, in other words. Usually the target is no more than 5. And maybe even no more than 3. So you really want to keep this down to the words that are really central to what your data product is about. And keywords have a little bit more structure to them in that when you add a new keyword, you have the opportunity to talk about whether the keyword comes from a controlled vocabulary or a controlled ontology of some sort. So there's an option to use the LTER controlled vocabulary, and there's a drop-down list. And controlled vocabularies are basically just lists of commonly used words in a given domain. In this case, it would be the long-term ecological research system. And they come up with a controlled vocabulary so people aren't using strange combinations of words or lots of different permutations of combination of words to mean the same thing. It's not quite the same thing as a dictionary, and this doesn't necessarily define the meaning of the words. It's just defining the most commonly used combinations of words or individual words to make sure that you aren't using a combination of words that isn't common in a given domain. Now, you don't have to use the LTER controlled vocabulary. If your keyword is coming from some other controlled vocabulary, you can tell it what keyword thesaurus you're using here. And there's other controlled vocabularies out there and other domains that you might use this from. If you can, it's nice to use a keyword that's coming from a controlled vocabulary, and therefore you can reference specifically, this is the context in which I mean this word in terms of the domain that it's in and its controlled vocabulary. We'll talk about examples of that when we talk about specific keywords. And lastly, there's one more category of data product summarization that doesn't show up in this list. Now, it's something that you can include in EML files, but EDI doesn't necessarily require it. And therefore, if you want to include it, you have to do it manually if you're making an EML file for EDI. And that's purpose. There is a way to put purpose for a given data set into an EML file, but EDI doesn't require it. The data curation librarian that I work with a lot really thinks that's important. Like, you need a separate statement that explicitly talks about the purpose. Now, you should also have at least a short general element of purpose in the abstract in terms of why the data were collected to begin with, but this purpose statement is a way to elaborate on that a little bit and be a little broader about what's the more general reason that we care about collecting these data. And that really adds information about the value of the data in general. So let's go back to our R code and add these new elements to the Markdown file that we're using to generate our README file. And generally, these are things that you want to be towards the top of your metadata. In terms of if somebody's first looking at the data, they want to see these things close to the top. So I'm going to work right after my title. Now, we haven't actually put a title on this data product yet. Now, this title is a little bit broader than what our actual data are. But the data that I'm using as an example come from a data product that it's titled something like this: photosynthetically active radiation at Louse and Porter Creek for the 2021 growing season, Judith River watershed, Montana, USA. So we give a little bit of what photosynthetically active radiation and where Louse and Porter Creek very specifically and more generally in the Judith River watershed of Montana and USA, and when for the 2021 growing season. So I cover a little bit of what, when, and where. Photosynthetically active radiation is something we measure all the time. I don't feel a need to say anything about how we measured it just because it's such a common thing to measure. So that's one quick summary that somebody will have a rough idea of what they're dealing with here and can make some quick judgment on whether this data is going to be meaningful to them or not. Then after the title, I want to add a new major heading, and I like to group together the rest of the summary information into its own major heading. So it's going to be a first level heading. That I call general summary. And again, I'm automating my numbers here by having an incrementing my section number 1 because this is going to be a new first level heading. And then underneath that, I'm going to have some second level headings. The first one is going to be the abstract. And this is a second level heading. This is the first subsection in this first level heading. So I just set it, the second level number, to 1. And then I can put in the text of my abstract here. Now, I'm not going to read this to you. I'll let you read it on your own, either in my examples online or pausing the video. And you should find elements of who, what, when, where, and why all covered in this abstract somewhere, at least in general. That's really the job of the abstract, to make sure that people have a little bit of all of those things. And when I say who, it doesn't necessarily have to be individual people. It could be institutions or projects. So the who here is talking about this cruise project, not necessarily individual people and their names, more like who instigated, was there a project or a funding project that instigated it, or some sort of institution that instigated it, that sort of thing. So that is what an abstract is about. Then after the abstract, I want to add that purpose statement I was talking about. And what you'll find here is a broader description of why we're working in the Judith River watershed to begin with. This is part of a project that's been in a long string of research happening in the Judith River watershed. And I would just want to acknowledge the more general motivation for why we are collecting these data at this particular location. And finally, the keywords. And in this case, I'm listing the keywords by thesaurus if there is a thesaurus. So there's several where there isn't a thesaurus, but the last one here is in a thesaurus. And maybe I should put this one first. But the keyword here is obviously the one main piece of data that we're providing here is photosynthetically active radiation. And this term, photosynthetically active radiation, not photosynthetic active radiation, or photosynthetic radiation without the active. Those are all the different permutations you might imagine for this. But we try to encourage consistency for when we're talking about photosynthetically active radiation, that we actually use these words. And this is the term for it that you'll find in the LTER controlled vocabulary if you look it up. Generally, you could just Google these controlled vocabularies and find some sort of online dictionary you can use to find terms in that dictionary. Also, there are a few keywords that we're using here that are tied more to where the project happened or where the data was from in some sort of standardized terms. Also, there's some standardized terms here in terms of what project generated the data. We thought that was important for this particular project. But there's really no thesaurus for these to speak of in terms of a formalized control vocabulary. Now, some of these terms are very formalized in terms of being part of a very specific definition. For example, Northern Great Plains is very formalized. That's part of the EPA's definition of ecoregions. So we thought it's really important to have something that's apolitical in nature in terms of no boundaries involved, but especially for a project like this, where the kind of ecosystem you're working in is kind of important to thinking about how systems work. The Northern Great Plains ecoregion is a very particular set of ecosystems that you find in northwestern parts of North America. Also, we have some political borders here in terms of Montana and northwestern United States. These are telling us something about where things are located relative, to current boundaries relative to countries and states. And then there's a hydrographic description that's kind of important to me because I'm a hydrologist, so I tend to think in terms of where things are relative to watersheds. Judith River is a fairly well-known river. It's probably not going to change that reference in a while or for a while. So if you talk about the Judith River watershed, people are probably going to find it. And finally, a little bit about the project. We decided that we wanted to be able to find data from this project based on, in this case, it's a grant ID. So if you want to be able to find data by a project somehow, you might want to include some sort of project identifier as part of your keyword. So there's just a few different categories of the different kinds of keywords that you might expect to put here. And again, fewer keywords are better in terms of making sure that you're really focusing on the key things that people might want to use to search for your data. So let's make sure that these new sections render properly. If we render our README file, I think I already have it open in a browser here. So let's go back to our README and I'll hit refresh. And now we have a title, and our title is actually filled in. We have a title in our title section. And we have this general summary section with abstract purpose keywords, noting that all our numbering automatically updated after we inserted this new section. And our abstract is basically just a paragraph of material, our purpose another paragraph, and then our keywords are listed according to any sort of controlled vocabulary they might be a part of.